Good morning. I'm John Barnes, Executive Director of Funders Concerned About AIDS. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, How to Build Strong and Resilient Organizations. First, I'd like to thank our co-sponsor, Council on Foundations, our speakers who will be introduced shortly, and our moderator, Roxana Bonnell. Roxana is a senior advisor to the Open Societies Foundation and a consultant to FCAA on our COVID learning project. Roxana was part of a team of consultants who helped FCAA produce our recent report, Converging Epidemics, COVID-19, HIV, and Inequality, which can be found on our website. This webinar is part of a series of follow-up activities FCAA has planned to take a closer look at examples of best practice in implementing the recommendations of that report. In seeking out those examples, FCAA wanted to highlight the COVID-19 pledge implemented by the Council on Foundations, asking the philanthropic community to act with urgency to assist communities hardest hit by COVID-19, as well as the Ford Foundation, one of the partners in that pledge. Before I turn it over to Roxana, I just wanted to go over a few logistics. All attendees will be on mute. The session will be recorded, and you can offer comments via the chat or questions You can offer comments via chat or questions via the Q&A function there. Not easy for me to say. Okay, so now with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Roxana.
Thanks, John. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. As John already said, this is a conversation that is building on a report that I did with a few other consultants that was released in April that looked at the intersection of COVID response, HIV response, and growing inequities and inequalities around the world. And the outcome or the learnings from that report really highlighted the fact that when we spoke to groups on the ground, they reported strongly that the problems that they are facing, the challenges they are facing, are not new challenges, that COVID has deepened and maybe sharpened some of the problems with access, with all kinds of inequalities in society and around health and medicine access. But again, the pandemic did not create these challenges and problems. And what really came out of the report was a strong support for funders and donors to really focus on giving as much funding as possible through core, flexible grants, multi-year grants, that grantees can also be involved in terms of decision-making or prioritization of what the grants will address and how, right? Because again, who we spoke to said, our tactics aren't new. We know how to do this. The problems aren't new. We just need to be further unleashed in a certain sense so that we can do what we know needs to be done and in the way we know it needs to be done. And so this morning we have representatives from a foundation, the Ford Foundation, that has committed in quite a high profile way to following many of these requests, that we heard from grantees working very much at local levels. So we're going to hear from Victoria, who is part of the program team at Ford, about their experience both in creating this structure called Build and what they've learned along the way. We're then also going to hear from Noma, who is part of the senior leadership team at the Treatment Action Campaign. I'm sure you've all heard of the Treatment Action Campaign in the past, one of the foremost HIV advocacy organizations around the world. And TAC is a Build grantee. So we're going to hear about their experience, about what they've been able to do and also not do as a result of build funding, particularly in the context of COVID and COVID response. And then we're going to hear from Natalie, who is part of the senior leadership team at the Council on Foundations, and she's been involved in the philanthropy pledge, as well as thinking about the strategy that I think was recently announced at the Council on Foundations that goes back to a lot of this learning that came out of the report that we did a couple months ago, as well as many, many reports coming out from various communities about grant making principles and how to be most impactful as donors. What we're going to do is start with about 30 minutes of questions that I'm going to direct, first of all, primarily to Victoria and Noma, and then a little bit later in the conversation to Natalie as well. After about 35 minutes, we're going to open it up to Q&A from all of you. So please do note your questions because there will be time in about a half an hour for you to pose questions to them. So we're going to start with Victoria. And Victoria, thanks for joining us this morning. My first question to you is, in our interviews for the report, we were told by a lot of program people that they would love to do grant making in this kind of fashion, right? Multi-year core flexible funding, but that either senior leadership or board or even finance or legal teams can be a challenge sometimes to figure out how to realistically or practically make it happen. So could you talk about what the experience was at Ford, let's say in 2014, 2015, when the build program just started, the political kind of support for it? Where did it come from? How did it develop a little bit to get to the point where you've recommitted as a foundation to, I think, a second tranche of it? So over to you, Victoria, for a little bit of that historical learning.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you. It is wonderful to be here with Noma, a Build grantee and wonderful partner on the journey of Treatment Action Campaign. Thanks to Roxana and John and Funders Concerned About AIDS and Council on Foundations and all the participants. We're so glad you showed up today to talk about this. It is possible and it can be done. But I'll tell you a little bit more how. So back in 2014, 2015, Darren Walker had assumed the president role of the Ford Foundation. And Hillary Pennington, the executive vice president of Ford, two people in the senior leadership that had come from the NGO and nonprofit space, had faced, raising money, had experienced the nonprofit starvation cycle themselves, had experienced, being curtailed and hindered in their own mission and programs by the constraints of funding. They did a listening tour with our grantee partners to learn more about what they were experiencing, as well as analysis of our grants over the years. Back in 2015, 64% of our grants went out as project support. Today, that is only 17%. But as you can see, 2/3 of our grants were going out in the form of project support. And around, it was really November 2015, Darren announced Ford Forward that included a $1 billion commitment to Build. Build is building institutions and networks. $1 billion commitment over 5 years would allow for multi-year support, unrestricted support, and dedicated funding for institutional strengthening for our key partners, those that are essential to the ecosystem of what we're trying to do, those that are strategically aligned to our various program and regional office strategies. Was it easy? Darren has a way with words. He's incredibly good at what he does, but he did bring our board along. We have a board that is diverse. It also includes people from the nonprofit sector, leaders such as Cecile Richards and Ai-jen Poo and Brian Stevenson, as well as legal and finance people. And they bought in. They bought into the results, the listening tour, the data, and what needs to happen, how we are, really starving and constraining our own best partners in what they are trying to do. So there was, of course, the board, and they did approve the $1 billion 5-year commitment. There are other layers too that had to move. Finance, had to figure out how to allocate this long-term commitment of $1 billion. We have an endowment that can go up and down. They wanted to ensure to protect the endowment as well as ensure room for future flexible grant making and just our regular grant making pot. It equals about 40% of our grant making per year. And so they felt safe enough to commit that going forward in the endowment. Our legal team had to look at how general support goes. And there was buy-in, and we'll get to a lot of this over the course of our conversation. But there had to be buy-in of our program staff. And I love my program colleagues, and yet it was a hard adjustment for them, particularly at the beginning. They are completely bought in and huge Build fans now. But, losing a sort of carrot and a stick of, grant making and like, well, how do I enter into a relationship with them? How do I manage and monitor this grant if it's so flexible and so long-term? I'm not sure if this will work for smaller partners. I'm not sure if this isn't just our big legacy organizations. I'm not sure if this will work in the global South, So many questions. And, of course, we had early adapters and the build team to bring people along. And it has happened quite well to the point where, we are evangelists in this space that truly believe that build can help meet our shared strategic goals and aims and support our grantee partners in the best of ways to get the important work done.
Thanks, Victoria. One follow-up question to you, and then I'm going to go to Noma. The follow-up question, where you are right now, and let's say from Darren Walker's perspective, the other program officer's perspective, as well as then build perspective, would there be a difference in how all of those kind of categories measure the greatest impact you have seen from build so far? And what would you say they might identify as the greatest impact 6 years in?
I could speak about so much, and there is an external evaluation of build. That's a developmental evaluation, and there's an interim report on that. But I think I'd point in 2 to 3 directions. One is just ask our build grantee partners the difference it's made for them in being able to pursue their mission and programs, to adapt and respond to internal and external disruptions, to be able to plan beyond their face, their hand in front of their face, but like really look out into the out years. They can tell you, so much about what difference this makes. And I hope Noma will talk about that as well as any challenges it's been, because we recognize that, we want to hear the feedback. The second thing I would point to is the relationship with our program officers and the grantee partners. This is a relationship of support and accompaniment. It is not a carrot and stick approach. It's the idea that we have mutual and shared goals about what we want the world to look like in various spaces and sectors. And, we are each bringing something to the table, whether it's the funding and support and connections and networks, or, just the incredible knowledge and expertise and familiarity with the issue that our partners, our grantee partners have. The program officers say it changed the relationship. So just quickly, one quick quote is, I work with a program officer who's a fan of Build and always has been, but he said, I never thought it would change my relationship to the grantee partners this much. He said, I used to when I would have a monitoring call or a reporting call or a visit, it would be saying, did that workshop happen? Where's the report? How many people showed up? And we were just kind of talking about thing to thing to thing. Oh, that got delayed because of X or Y. He says, now my conversations have blown up into a much more macro, thoughtful, strategic conversation. It's not just about the distance traveled, but the direction traveled and the adjustments along the way. And he felt that, he says that it has really opened up his thinking in partnership and strategically with the grantee partners. And finally, COVID is a perfect example. With a build grant, the ability to adapt and move and pivot without, the constraints of more restricted funding has just, meant the world. Respond to opportunities, adapt to threats, and think big and long term.
Thank you. Noma, to you. My first question is really, how have you, as the Treatment Action Campaign, fundamentally experienced build funding in a way that's different from other funding that TAC receives? How has that looked different to you as TAC? And then how has that manifested itself in just what Victoria said, in relationships and in being able to adjust, particularly, I suppose, now at this COVID moment?
Okay, as a start one, I just want to mention that TAC, unlike other organizations, is a membership-based organization. And we have people working in offices, and we've got people working on the ground as field workers. And we've got branch members who are actually located across 8 provinces of the country. As an organization previously from Ford Foundation, we would receive funding for a specific program. Specifically, Ford funded us for SRHR. Say they will fund for SRHR in Gauteng. Now, when that funding came, it was targeting a specific province, a specific community with specific targets and a specific time, which was like a year program. And one of the challenges with that was you couldn't replicate that program in another province unless you get funding from another funder. And another funder wouldn't actually do something that is actually additional to somebody else. They would come up with another program of their own, even if it was SRHR. So it was a challenge in the sense that once we got funding for this project, we'll get another funding from Ford again next year for the same province, but not another province. And we still continue to doing the work in that particular province. And when we do work in this province, you can actually see that it's making a difference, but you do not have resources to multiply or to do the same activity somewhere else. But when we came to 2016-17, we received a grant from Build. There was a change. Firstly, there was a change in the actual application process, because the process was understanding the organization as a whole, understand the objectives of the organization. What is the mission of the organization? How do you hope to achieve the mission? What kind of activities do you think would be critical in achieving the mission of the organization? You've got so many objectives. Of these objectives, what kind of things do you think would be done to make sure that these objectives are achieved? So in essence, it made us even to revisit our own objectives and also to think in terms of okay, we said that we as an organization, we have 4 key campaigns. The first campaign is access to medicines. And then the second campaign is monitoring and HIV and TB. Another campaign is broadly focusing on advocacy at a local, national, and international level. The last one is health system strengthening. So you would get a funder that would actually fund only health system strengthening. But when you're looking at the 4 areas of work, they are linked, because you cannot have system strengthening without looking at access to medicines. You cannot have the two without looking at advocacy that needs to be done on the ground. A simple example, when we got the grant, the BUILD grant, it actually allowed us to put all the four together in one pot. It allowed us to actually look at the whole organization holistically. It allowed us to actually start thinking, when we are actually looking at certain things. Let's take health system strengthening for an example. It's a broader issue, but when you're looking at it generally, it looks in terms of like quality healthcare services. It looks in terms of like, how do you ensure that you get people to actually have a positive health seeking behavior? It looks in terms of like doing monitoring at facility level and ensuring that the facility is actually meeting the requirements by the law in terms of what it's supposed to be doing. It also looks in terms of like, how do we as an organization look at the communities that we serve? And those communities raise questions and concerns. How do you take them back to that facility? And how do you actually, when the facility cannot meet those, how do we take them to the next level, be at the district level, at the provincial level, at a national level? At the same time, how do you start addressing policy issues that are impacting on that issue on its own? So you find a situation whereby you get a funder that would fund you only for the policy aspect of it. You get a funder that would fund you only on the monitoring aspect of it. Now we got BUILD. It allowed us to do everything that we wanted to do as an organization. So we can actually take things a step further. We can actually have those district meetings with duty bearers and get them to listen to community members, which is not funded by another person. Yet those issues, we had identified them during the monitoring, but the monitoring ends there. It doesn't actually take you a step further because the funding is specific to that particular issue. So we are able to start addressing issues. A day ago, we were actually doing there are hearings for the NHI bill, which has been in front of Parliament for a long time, but because of some of the issues that have been happening in the country, it's not yet been passed. So we're able to put our issues in front of Parliament to say, these are our concerns on the NHI bill. But before we did that NHI bill, we did research. We went around the country with our partners, Section 27, you'd know them, and we collected information. Nobody is funding that, but through Ford, we were able to actually get funding to do the research, to gather information, which proves these are the challenges that we have identified on the country. Essentially, it allows us to look at issues holistically. It allows us as an organization to also be able not to worry about, if we do this, how are we going to take it a step further? We are able to take, one funder is funding us one aspect of the work, and then BUILD has been helping us to actually continue some of those activities. On the other hand, very few funders, even with the project funding or program funding, fund infrastructure, fund the actual core in terms of like the running cost of the organization. Let's forget about salaries because very few actually want to fund salaries. And yet people are supposed to actually implement the activities. And very few funders want to fund the rent of your building, yet you're supposed to be operating from somewhere, buying your printers, your laptops and everything else. So having a fund like this, that is actually allowing you to be quite diverse. You are able to actually look at where the gaps are within the work that you are doing, and you plug into those gaps. And on the other hand, we've got, we're working with program officers who have been able to say, oh, we saw you were doing this. Oh, we saw this. What is your response on that particular issue? Then we were able to discuss, like, we are actually responding, but we're worried. We were not sure if it will meet the BUILD objectives. And then the project officer would advise in terms of like, yeah, if we write something up, then we'll be able to do that. So it's been also like that kind of support where we have check-ins on, we were supposed to have one last week. Unfortunately, something happened, we couldn't have it. But this check-ins is just like an update, not formal meetings, not formal report writing, but just to get an understanding of where things are, or on our side to just update the project officer in terms of like where we are as an organization, or what are the challenges on the ground, because we are working in this particular environment and they might not understand what is happening there. But one of the things that emerged from the Build grant was the fact that, I think that's what Victoria was talking about, was where one of the project officers acknowledged the fact that she is learning more about what is happening out there, not just what TAC is doing, but broadly on the issues that are actually relating to health, that are actually impacting negatively on the society, not because of the grant, but because of the reports, because the reports are quite broader now. And they are also looking at the country, they're looking at the sector, and then looking at the organization. They are not only focused on the project itself.
Thank you, Noma. So I'd like to follow up with both of you on that. And the question is, and Victoria, you mentioned that, there had been an assessment done, I suppose, before the second tranche or the renewal of the Build program, I think this year. What are a couple of key lessons that Ford has learned, and like those major or minor changes that you have made in the Build program based on the last 5 years of that assessment? And then Noma, I'm going to come to you next and say, okay, from where you're experiencing this, are there additional changes that you think would be important to think about, or additional changes that you think, as you look back, TAC would have done something differently, either with the money or with the organizational development opportunity? So lessons learned, right? Victoria, let's start with you with the assessment and lessons learned from Ford's perspective.
Super, thank you. So, from our developmental evaluation, and we can make sure that the link, is shared to the interim report. We'll have a final report at the end of this year. And it's a developmental evaluation. There's 363 different Build grantees out there. Everyone is a different size, a different sector, a different stage of development, dealing with different things and using their Build grants in different ways because it is ultimately flexible. So it had to be a developmental evaluation. So what we are learning is that this is a very good way to fund grantees. We have found that it's not a single aspect of Build, which we were kind of curious about, like, is it the fact that it's a 5-year horizon, or is it the institutional strengthening that matters the most? It was the combination of being able to look outwards 5 years and plan for that and have that stability as they are seeking new funding and making new plans and pursuing mission and adapting to circumstances. It's the 5-year horizon. It is also the unrestricted support. And it is also the fact that there is dedicated support for institutional strengthening. So while general support might be used for institutional strengthening, we know that organizations don't always use it. They put programs first. They, invest in their programs. So it's that mix, that they could, invest in themselves, that is a key component of Build, and together with these other things. And we all know, who would have predicted a pandemic and the various disruptions and the pivots we've all had to make. It is, Build grants, have allowed for all sorts of disruptions and adaptations. So that is, a key learning of the report. Two things that we are looking at, particularly as we move forward with the Build, what we call Build 2.0, the additional $1 billion that has been approved for Build grants from 2022 to 2027. We're going to look a little bit closer at the size of grants. We are trying to make it so that a Build grant is significant and meaningful to the organization, that they can actually sort of invest in their transformation, that they can think big, that they can put the money where it's needed and not feel too constrained. And of course, we also want to look at, not creating a dependency, looking at, financial resilience more broadly, what are the areas. So what is the right size for a build grant? And mostly that will be thinking about the organization's budget, but it will also be looking at other things. What is their mix of funding and funding sources and even types of funding? What is the, how much of their funding is restricted? Those sorts of things. How, what's the future plan with this organization and our strategic alignment? So while we can't predict exactly in 5 years, what might Ford be thinking? So is this sort of, we don't view it as a tie-off, but, is this, putting them in a better position, or is this, just the first of many long-term relationships and funding? And the second thing we are looking closely at, or more closely at, is in addition to the grant, we have some non-grant supports, things like convenings, things like technical assistance for build grantees, and cohorts. And cohorts can be organized in many different ways. They could be all the build grantees in Southern Africa, which would include tech, but it might be all the organizations that are experiencing a leadership transition, or a cohort of all build grantees in their first year that are just trying to figure out what to do with this. So cohorts, convenings, and technical assistance, we want to design that well to be useful, supportive, adaptive, not stretch us too far in the process, because we can't be designing 4,000 programs. We're trying to figure out what are the most timely supports. We expect that there will be an emphasis on financial resilience as one of the sort of key areas of support. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the way organizations are thinking about that and addressing that, both in the US and in the Global South. We also expect an increased attention to cybersecurity, safety and security, but also cybersecurity. Many of our partners are social justice organizations that are under threat in varieties of ways. So cybersecurity and safety and security more broadly, and leadership, in particular, leadership transitions. We have had, I think, more than half of our build grantees have experienced a leadership transition over the course of their build grants. We don't think it is necessarily due to the build grant, although it might provide them some stability and security and runway for everyone to take a breath and for leaders to feel okay about moving on, or even invest in a search and what it takes to have a smooth leadership transition. But we're also seeing a transformation in leadership, transformation by race, gender, and generation, and also increasing shifts to new leadership structures, such as co-leadership models. And in that leadership, I want to include governance. We're seeing, how can the governance and the boards be stronger. So those are some areas of emphasis. I think we'll be both refining the what and the how. So the what being what areas are most needed to support outside of the grant, what institutional strengthening areas are most needed to be supported outside of the grant, and the how. Is this by cohorts? Is this in trainings? Is this how what's the best delivery platform to reach groups and to have it useful and valuable to them?
Great. So Noma, then coming to you, lessons learned, key lessons learned, one or two. And if there's anything specific that you would do differently, looking back over your build experience so far and how TAC has experienced it. When Noma's done, we're going to go to Natalie, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A from everyone. So Noma, to you.
Okay. One, when we got the grant, we kind of like shivered, if that's the right word to use, because it was a lot of money and for a short period of time. And we were not used to actually multi-year funding. We are used to receiving the single year grants, which are, even if it's like a lot of money, but it's only tied to a year. One of the things that was a challenge on our side was in year one, we kind of idled, if that's the right word to use. We spent most time planning instead of implementing anything. We planned and then we replanned. And then that on its own, there was a lapse of time because we kept thinking, no, this is not right. No, we need to rethink this. We need to check this out. Oh, no. Maybe we need to double check with Ford. Is this okay? And so we had already received a confirmation that we've got the grant. But now the challenge was, how do we implement this grant? How do we not mess it up? How do we make sure that we've got all our plans in place? And we also started looking in terms of the infrastructure within the organization, which was super old. And old as in when TAC, it moved from Cape Town to Johannesburg, we moved and we didn't even have proper facilities in Johannesburg. So we were sharing an office with the regional office, with the Gauteng regional office. So we had to get proper offices. We got proper offices. Now we're sitting there thinking how are we going to finance this? Because we need proper infrastructure, we need proper offices. But now, halfway through, the project officer actually was quite useful in advising in terms of what is your priority? She didn't tell us what to do, which was quite annoying, I must say, at the time, because we wanted answers, we wanted somebody to say, maybe you can do this with the money. But she was asking us questions. And then after asking us questions, we had to go and think, okay, this is what we should be doing. So we spent a couple of months not necessarily doing anything because we're thinking we need to get it right. And that on its own wasted some time. But on the other hand, it allowed us to plan properly. And by the time we got to year two, we had already realized that some of the things we had planned for in year one were actually things that were not important because we couldn't plan for all the 5 years. We had to plan for each year. After we had planned, the second year we started planning, we realized that some of the things that we actually couldn't implement were not actually important because it went back to the question, what is your priority? What do you think is critical within the organization? What kind of things do you think you want to achieve? What should make this organization sustainable? And we started looking into that. And the other thing that was actually, I think, was helpful are the sessions that we're having with Build, because there is this program called FIRE. It's more like capacity building, if I may, for me, who has attended those sessions, and also other colleagues who have actually participated in some of the sessions, because we sit in there. You talk about financial sustainability, you talk about communication, you talk about human resource, you talk about various issues within the organization. And there is experts talking to you about these issues. There's other organizations sitting in the same room, sharing ideas and information, and start looking at your own situation, and you start realizing this actually was quite useful, and the materials that is shared in there, you end up taking this material back to the organization and start sharing it with everybody or the relevant departments within the organization so that they can improve on the work that we are doing. So I think for me, we do not have that kind of support from other funders that we've been having. With this funder, we actually are getting the support whilst you are sitting in the office. You don't have to travel anywhere. You don't have to do much. Some people bring the information to you, but at least you are able to join with another colleagues who would actually be supportive to you. And on the other hand, you get some of these sessions that are only South Africa focused. Then you are able to say, oh, maybe I should contact those guys and have this conversation outside these meetings so that I can get a better understanding. When you're hearing what people are doing and how they actually are struggling with certain things, you start having those relationships with other funded partners where you are able to actually get some more clarity. Or how did you do that? I heard that in the meeting you said you did 1, 2, 3, 4. How did you manage to do that? Because you've been struggling with that. So it essentially, the biggest learning from this whole period has been that funders are not necessarily your enemy, or it's a partnership relationship where you actually get as much information as you can that would actually help implement what you're working on. And where you're struggling with certain issues, you are able to ask the questions. And there are people who can actually help you. There is materials that is out there, like from the fire team, that they actually help you with, which also is actually additional to what we are getting in the funding. And for me, the other thing that has actually been the biggest learning was the macro approach, the qualitative approach, and the support issue. Because the qualitative approach has actually made it easier for us not to worry about keeping statistics that you end up having to run around, spending more time getting the numbers than doing the actual work that you need to do. I'm not saying that those stats are not relevant. They are, but we are collecting them in the relevant environments. But with this particular grant, it's not asking us about statistics. It's asking us about impact. It's asking about the change that we have seen, be it within the organization or the change we see within the area of work that we are implementing. And we have seen the change within the organization because the biggest thing was that we got support for infrastructure. We didn't have that kind of support from anybody. And now we are able to use this example with other funders. That is like one of the things that has been, because we are able to say to the funder, but we've got a funder that has done 1, 2, 3, 4, and it has helped us this way. Would you consider? So we are able to do that.
Thank you, Noma. So I want to turn to Natalie now and ask, so, we've heard now both from Victoria and Noma, like a pretty inspiring example, right, of kind of unrestricted, long-term vision, flexible funding. And can you just say a few words, Natalie, about the genesis of the philanthropy pledge, maybe what it is, how people have been able to use it, and maybe a few words on what you're planning around it in case there are participants who would want to contribute or participate.
Yeah, absolutely. So I shared a link to the pledge in the chat for everyone. It is a pledge that was started really soon after COVID hit. So in the spring of last year, the language of the pledge actually came to us from the Ford Foundation, and they had helped co-create it with a number of other funders who had taken on these practices for a long time. For them, these are not new practices, but saw the moment of COVID and the possible impacts that it would have on nonprofits in the US and around the world as an opportunity for a call to action of other funders to embrace practices that have been promoted for a long time. So within the pledge, there are 8 bullets, and you can really summarize the bullets, if you will, as loosening restrictions on your grant grants, making any new grants as unrestricted as possible, reducing requirements and what we ask from nonprofits, funding communities that are directly focused on health and economic impact of COVID, communicating proactively and often with grantees, listening, especially to those communities least heard, supporting advocacy and public policy changes that make sure response to COVID is equitable and just, and learn from what's happening and consider adjusting your practices in the future. So when you look at those 8 bullets, almost immediately we had hundreds of foundations sign up and commit to those practices as they think through their COVID response. Today, we have over 800 foundations who have committed to the practices of the pledge. And there's been different sets of research on whether the whether the pledge signatories are actually following through with their commitments. And so we published a survey, a report last fall with Philanthropy California and Dahlberg Advisors, which really looked at how foundations are or aren't adapting these practices. We found that some of them are adapted more than others. So some of the processes around flexibility or general operating support, especially for grants made during COVID, were more adapted than some of the other practices like sharing power. And so our first analysis was really that sharing power is a lot harder to do, and really committing to internal practices on equity is harder to do than making your grants more flexible or making COVID grants unrestricted. And so then a second survey happened, which I know Ford helped support, by the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And once I finish talking, I can share all of these surveys in the chat with you. Those surveys by CEP came out at the very end of the year and were meant to be a baseline of, as the pledge is signed in the first year of response, what has funder response been? They similarly found that, for example, one-time general operating support grants increased greatly, but multi-year general operating support grants did not necessarily increase at the same rate. And so there are outstanding questions from the field, from us at the council, from other partners, of whether some of the changes that foundations have made on a larger scale post-COVID will last or not. Whether they were seen as one-time changes in an extenuating, unique circumstance of a global pandemic and a more reckoning with race, or if they can start to be the new normal that we have hoped for and many have called for a very long time. So that really is the question. CEP will be doing additional research next year to check back in with pledge signatories 18 months after they sign the pledge and see what practices have stuck and what have not. And there really, that is the true outstanding question, is what might be the new normal.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to turn it over, and before moving on, I just want to say 800 signatories to a pledge is pretty fantastic. So congratulations on that, and also will be really fascinating to see what can last after the pandemic or COVID hopefully passes or becomes less of an issue globally. So I'm going to turn this over to Christine Campbell. She's a consultant who worked with me on the report that we referenced at the beginning of the call. She is going to open it up to Q&A, and Victoria, Noma, and Natalie, just for your information, we're going to come back to you at the end just for one final thought or like outstanding question that you have that you want to share with everyone before signing off. So Christine, over to you to help facilitate some Q&A now for all the participants.
Thank you, Roxanne, and thank you all panelists. You've been absolutely phenomenal and informative in sharing what's been going on. So we really appreciate your time to participate in this webinar today. So we have a few questions in the question box. However, if you would like to ask a live question, please just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So while I'm monitoring that, we'll start with the first question, which is, what can state government do to support the BUILD program and others like it? Victoria, you are muted.
So I have to say I was a little bit, I did see that in the Q&A. So I guess I was a little bit confused on state partnerships on that. Maybe we could have a little bit more, definition, state or local government partnerships with grantees. So, certainly I can say that our grantee partners are often supported by state and local governments. They also are supported by bilateral and multilateral, as well as private funders. Yes, the build funding does complement their support. They are another contributor in the overall revenue recipe of these important and key partners. I mean, one thing that we have said and that we would ask is, all of us need to be supporting the true costs, or as I think Noma mentioned earlier, if there's not enough overhead in a grant, and that is whether it's private funding or state or local or multilateral or bilateral, if there's not enough overhead on the grant, they take it from other places, other funding sources, the more flexible funding sources, and they end up supporting the whole entire cost of what it takes to do the work. And that is not the intention of Build, is to, make sure that the organization runs while others, support projects. We need to take into account the entire costs and the true costs of what it takes to run these programs. There's no formal partnerships. We talk a lot with private foundations who have a lot of flexibility, and we've done some work on influencing government funders, mostly bilateral and multilateral funders.
Great, thank you. Can we open Catherine's line, Sarah?
1 second.
Catherine, are you there? Catherine? All right, we'll go to the next question. Build sounds like a really effective, holistic way of supporting organizations. At Frontline AIDS, we too have an accompaniment approach to build the capacity of partners. Not to the extent of Ford in terms of actual funding, but there are some similarities. I wanted to ask if there are any formal standards or accreditation for grantees linked to Build.
Excellent question, and I just want to thank you, Karen, and Frontline AIDS for supporting this in this way, accompaniment and capacity building. So formal standards or accreditation for grantees that link to Build. Not specifically. Of course, we have the usual funding criteria of it needs to be a 501c3 or a registered NGO, and if not, we have expenditure responsibilities, the typical things that go along with the regulatory needs of our field as funders. There are due diligence questions, of course, and the due diligence questions are typically around leadership and governance, finances, and what we're increasingly calling safe workplace. So, whistleblower policies in the Me Too movement, in Me Too moments, et cetera. So the due diligence incorporates a lot of this. There's not, part of Build, we have organizations of all ages, stages, and sizes. So there's not going to be, in fact, like some sort of gold standard of they need to be, doing things in a certain way as an NGO. If their finances need support and strengthening, they will use their Build grant to invest in their financial and accounting processes. Likewise, as they grow, those systems become more complex. And so there's that. I do want to just sort of point, at least for Africa, the organization called EPIC Africa, that is, really lifting up very effective management practices and standards for, NGOs within Africa, but not a specific accreditation process. It's really about our due diligence up front. And I'm going to say anyone can get a Build grant, but any size, stage, age of organization can get a Build grant, and they will strengthen their operations and systems with it.
Thank you. Noma, I'm going to direct this question to you from Paul Gilbert from the Red Umbrella Fund. Very interesting. I was wondering about whether panelists found a way to respond to the questions that are being raised regarding dependency, especially for organizations led by criminalized populations that represent a large proportion of new HIV cases and who cannot access government funding. Sometimes it feels like the fear of the organization becoming dependent, reliant on funding is used as a reason not to fund organizations led by criminalized populations.
Okay, I'm not sure how things are in other countries, but in most of the countries this side of the Atlantic, most organizations don't take government money. Not because we don't want government money, but because you cannot, how do you say it? You know the concept of biting the hand that feeds you? Most of the work that we do is to actually keep government at check. Let me give you an example. TAC took government to court. We took a South African government to court and won. Now, if we were funded by government, there is no way we would have taken government to court. So we've done that twice and we've won both cases. And those cases have made a change on the ground. And those cases have forced government to change policy. Those cases have forced government to actually do things differently. The way things are happening is that a lot of organizations that are service organizations, then they actually complement what government is doing on the ground. The work that we do is not necessarily against government. We work with government. Because we work with government, we actually get permission to go to facilities. Government actually writes a letter to all heads of departments in all provinces to say, allow TAC to do their work in this province, allow TAC to go to health facilities and all that kind of stuff. But the issue of some organizations not getting funding is actually the context of the organization. It's not just those organizations. Look at a lot of LGBTQIA organizations. They're not getting funding, not just from government, but from other funders, purely because of the stigma. It's still there. Look at other organizations that are not receiving funding purely because they are actually not religious or they are challenging certain issues around religion. So those things are still there. Those things are still problematic. One of the things as an organization we have agreed on is to say that we are not going to take a position on certain issues because we are servicing communities that are actually diverse and that have got various needs. So when you start looking in terms of like the funding that is coming in, there is a problem in that issue because look at PEPFAR, the way PEPFAR funds, look at USAID, the way they fund. It has got a negative impact on communities. That money comes through government for those communities, but a lot of these organizations on the ground cannot access the money because of policies that are in place. So the challenge that is out there is not necessarily the organization, but is what is guiding the funding itself. Because if those policies can change, the government policies, then it means that those organizations would actually operate easily. Let's take the case of community healthcare workers. Those people are people that are doing work that is supposed to be done by government, but government doesn't have the capacity to do the work on the ground. But governments, in all aspects, they are actually neglecting that area of society, those organizations that actually are supposed to be doing their work. They are not willing to actually support those organizations, yet these are the organizations that are making their lives easy. Look at COVID-19 right now. Who is going into communities and actually encouraging people to go and register? It's the same community healthcare workers. Those organizations are not even funded by government. And these organizations are not even having anything you can call stigma. So the problem is in the policies that actually guide funding, not the organization or the nature of the organization.
Thank you so much, Noma. We appreciate that. We're going to circle back to the first question we had, Victoria, around coordination with public and private funding. And Catherine, I'm so sorry about your mic, but well, I'll do my best to translate your question. So Catherine was talking about she's knowing that there's not much coordination done, that there's much coordination done indirectly, and was wondering if there was a way of being more open. And knowing that there's coordination to purposely have funders fill the gaps that government's not doing, but is there a model, does the build model address that type of coordination of being able to fill some of those gaps that government is not able to yet do?
I'm going to take this, I'm going to take my response in two ways. Yes, private funders, funding like Build can help plug the gaps, I would say, strategically in areas that government can't fund. So for example, I think of, when you're working with criminalized and stigmatized and marginalized populations and communities, that for whatever reason, the government money can't support. Like private funders have the flexibility to do that and say, this is needed and effective, and this is how we're going to support these groups. And I think this also goes a little bit to the question from Red Umbrella as well. So yes, they can fund the gaps where it is difficult or impossible to for government funders to support in certain areas. Where Build does not want to fund the gaps is on the true costs. And so if it's the overhead or what it really costs to do a program, Build is not designed to sort of let other funders sort of put the onus on private funders on filling the gaps of what it really costs to do a program, to get out there and travel, to work in an office, to hire real and qualified staff and retain them and pay them fairly and well and with vacation and benefits. I mean, that is not the purpose of Build. So I guess I'm just saying yes, plugging the gaps on difficult to fund areas strategically, no to funding the gaps on what a program and mission and organization really costs to do this critically important and very complex work.
Thank you so much. All right, we have another question of how does Ford measure impact with Build grants as they are core flexible grants? And how do grantees best measure and report impact from core flexible grants? So this is kind of a question for Victoria and Noma.
I'm going to start, if that's okay, Noma. Measurement. Yeah, no, this is really important question. We get it a lot. And again, I'm going to answer it from sort of three different angles. Of course, the organizations, we hope that they are monitoring and evaluating and learning from their own work. And we hope that they are doing it with a mix of qualitative and quantitative evidence of showing what works and what's been achieved and applying that learning. We say, and we're not the only ones, no numbers without stories, no stories without numbers. So when numbers are presented, what do those numbers tell us? What is missing from those numbers? What do we understand about those numbers? And what's inside and what's outside of that number? And the stories of, why and how that program worked or progressed the way it did or didn't. And we hope and want to hear how the grantee partners, and Noma can talk more about how they evaluate their own work or their own grant at that level, at the organizational level, or even at the grant level. The second place I want to talk about it, the next two are really from the foundation. And there's two things. There's the strategic and programmatic evaluation and learning, and there's the grant making evaluation and learning. Each of our programs and regional offices have a strategy. It's things that they want to make a dent in, move the needle on in the next, we actually have 10-year strategic plans that get a revisit at 5 years. So we want to, we have a theory of how change happens. We have areas that we want to work in those areas, and we have organizations that we're investing in to achieve those goals. Those programs are evaluated, and recently I saw an evaluation for our gender, racial, and ethnic justice program that literally looked at the whole portfolio. We're evaluating ourselves in this case, not the individual grant, and saying to what extent has the portfolio of grantees moved the needle on this area. And it was, low extent, moderate extent, or high extent, right? The collection of grantees and the investments we're making. And so they are trying to figure out whether our strategy is working and whether we're making progress towards our goals. And, other things, lessons, what we're missing, are there key actors, if there's a lot of advocacy, but perhaps not a lot of research, do they feel like that's missing from achieving their strategy? And they can look and refine and re-strategize and reinvest in, for example, maybe a couple more research areas or academics. And then the third is the how, because build is a how, not a what. Build is an approach to grant making that we take with, 380 or so of our grantee partners, of probably, 1,000. It also represents, coincidentally, about 40% of our budget. So it is a way of funding them. And there we want to say, are the organizations becoming more strong and more resilient through this type of grant making, either because they've made investments in their institutional strengthening, or because of their investments in institutional strengthening, they can accelerate and amplify their impact. And they have a common sense pathway of, they said, we invested in our HR, and because of that, we were also more effective and impactful with our programs. Why? Because we stopped losing staff because of compensation or something like that. Or we could attract really good talent. We are also evaluating the way of this type of funding in terms of, the relationship that we have, which I've talked about. And just generally, and again, this is around direction traveled, not necessarily distance traveled. Of course, it's both, but it's around these one-on-one conversations that we're having with individual organizations, as well as cohorts of our program partners about, like, what do we know about our shared strategic goals? What's affecting us internally and externally on these? Is the civic space, more hostile? And how are we coping with this? And are we still headed in the right direction, right? So it's really kind of taking stock of the landmarks, the terrain, and understanding, we have goals, and are we getting towards them? Are we headed in the right direction? Have we adapted appropriately, et cetera? So that's how I would answer that. Grant, organizational level, strategy level, and then this whole approach, and what difference has this made in funding in a build-like way rather than another way? Who let
Thank
the
you.
dogs out? I've got dogs.
And Noma, how do you best measure and report the impact from core flexible grants?
Okay, as a start, I just want to show you, I don't know if you can see this publication. Yes. In the last year, we actually did a stock take. We hired somebody to actually look at our operations during the time of COVID-19. And this is a report that was done by somebody. And okay, this is one of the things that we funded through Build. The reason why we did this study was to see how, as an organization, we fared in the last year, given all the challenges that we experienced and all the environmental challenges that were out there due to COVID-19. So somebody did an assessment of TAC to say, how did you do as an organization under pressure of COVID-19? Mm-hmm. So that on its own, it shows that we didn't do it ourselves. We got an external person to look at us and then advise us, are we doing well? Are we failing? Are we faltering? And what are the challenges? The other thing is that in the last 4 years, we took some of our staff to school. People, for an example, in finance, they are already in that department, but then we asked people, what would you like to do? What skills would you like to improve so that you can do your job? Or if you wanted to leave, because we cannot pretend people are not going to leave, at least you have actually improved on some area of work. So other than the finance team, we started looking at other departments. What kind of skills would people like to learn so that they can actually, they might be in the wrong department. They might be more effective in another department within the organization. How can the organization support their needs? How can the organization support? We've got, for an example, a staff wellness program that we never had before. This staff wellness program is looking at individuals' health. It's looking at individuals' well-being within the organization. And this program, we came up with it so that we can actually make sure that we're not just focused on people who are just working every day. We also are conscious of the fact that people have got their own challenges outside work. And we can actually look in terms of how do we take care of that. And other than that program, we also have looked in terms of how do we get our TAC is like a funny organization in the sense that we've got staff, you've got the board, and then you've got the leadership. So you've got 3 centers of power. So whilst you've got the board, which is responsible for the fiduciary responsibilities in terms of the law, you've got the leadership of the organization that is responsible for the constitutional implementation and other areas of work. And how do you put the two together so that there is a broader understanding on how do we do the work? And those kinds of engagements, the discussions on what is happening. And fortunately enough, all our board members are specialists in their areas of work. And how do you actually make sure? So we looked in terms of their how do you call it? Their involvement, not involvement within the organization. We've got a lawyer. So what role is he playing within, and not just the organization, but broadly? And how can we use that to actually support some of the work that we're doing? We've got a medical doctor. How can he support some of the work that we are doing without necessarily getting an external person, but also those people understanding how we do things? We had to change a treasurer purely because we understood that the treasurer we had was more corporate orientated. He didn't understand civil society work. So these are the things that we didn't know or understand previously. Now, the more we are learning, and is the more we started looking in terms of how do we put our house in order and also get certain things in place. So a lot of people now, we've got committees that are in place. We've got things that we didn't have before. Of course, there's limited cost, but the fact that now we've learned that there is the need for these things to actually happen has been because we've learned so much from the period we've been engaging in some of these, what do you call it, especially on fire. And also we've learned a lot of stuff through engagement with other organizations. Now we've realized that as an organization, there are certain changes we need to put in place, which gradually we have been putting. Some people have started to say we're corporatizing the organization, but no, we're just trying to make sure that systems are in place. Now we were doing monitoring manually. Now we've got a system in place, ComCare, which is actually doing the monitoring, collecting all the information and making sure that we can analyze it from this angle and we can use it for decision-making and other, we can use it actually even to inform government in terms of what are the gaps that we've identified, because the tool can actually generate reports. So these are the things that previously we never cared much about, but now they are on our fingertips.
Great.
Christine, we are at time. We're almost at time. Thank you, Christine, for that. And I really want to just take a moment to thank Noma, Natalie, and Victoria for experience and kind of framing today as to inspirational possibilities for the funders and donors on the line. We are at time, but I want to give you each 30 seconds. The people on the line are all donors and funders, right? So if you have something that you would like for them to keep in mind, for the rest of 2021, right? And how they do their work based on today's conversation in a really tough, health moment globally, right? What would you like to share? So Natalie, to you first.
Sure. I mean, what I would just say is from all of the great experience shared today, it's just a reminder that many practices within foundations are not required by US law. They are practices your foundation has designed, and you have the power to rethink them. And there is a lot of evidence out there for how rethinking flexibility, working with grantees, communicating in different ways, shifting how you determine and negotiate power can have a very impactful impact on the work you're doing and the grantees you work with. So rethink those systems, processes. There are many organizations who can help you with that, and learn from colleagues who've already done it.
Great. Victoria.
First of all, go NOMA. You're amazing. Treatment Action Campaign. Way to go. Couple things. The funders on the line, thank you for showing up and learning and being interested in this. You are brilliant, strategic, funny, and good looking, and we're glad you're here. Second, you don't need to be a billionaire. Yes, BUILD is $1 billion program over 5 years. Ford is not the first to do this. Family foundations, smaller foundations, many foundations have done this, nor are we the best. Some people have been learning and doing this for quite a long time, and this is the only way they do their funding. We happen to be the largest, most visible, and we have a platform, and we are happy to share and influence and help other funders find their way. Second, if you start anywhere, start with, if you have to do project support, please increase your overhead and indirect cost. Ford's minimum is now 20%, and I believe I heard MacArthur is now at 25% for indirect costs. So if you start anywhere with your direct funding, just raise your overhead. And if you can go farther than that, if you can't go all the way to BUILD-like funding, please look at your grantee partners, figure out who are the ones that you are finding effective and inspirational and getting the job done. And look at that set first and figure out how you can unleash, I literally unleash your support to them. And you can do that with your trust. You can do that with the latitude you give them for using the funding, meaning less restricted, more broad. You can do that with longitude, which is not a real word in funding, but what I mean is longer term support. And you can do that by investing in these organizations, their future, they're just, stronger organizations. You can invest, whether it's through institutional strengthening funding or otherwise, being part or all of your grant, so that they are lasting, viable, strong, resilient, and effective. They have internal investments that they need to make to be so. And please, consider doing this with at least some of your partners. It will make a huge difference in the road we're on.
Great. And last important word then to NOMA to finish us off today.
Okay, from our side, I think the first thing is to actually acknowledge the fact that all funders that are here actually play an important role wherever they work, because the resources that are given to communities are actually put into good use. On the other hand, I want to say that if TAC was able to convince PEPFAR to fund TAC, even though we do not take money from PEPFAR, we do not take money from USAID, we do not take money from the American government, but we've got funding from them. So where there are challenges, consider, what do you call it? Sorry, I spoke before thinking. Now, we are funded through somebody else, but we are still getting the same money. So we are not getting or suffocated by the same policies or the same guidelines that actually, if we're getting money directly from PEPFAR, we're getting money from UNAIDS. Now, I'm saying that where organizations or the funders are struggling with certain issues, consider subgranting to subgrantees, whatever that is called. So subgranting through somebody else, because that we have managed as an organization to do it. And PEPFAR, I think I must say that Ambassador Bex was quite good in facilitating this and getting it to happen. And it's continuing post her presence within the scope of work. Now, other funders can do it. I know that in some instances, certain policies or certain sources of funding do not allow certain things, but there are ways of circumventing those through subgranting. But on the other hand, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. HIV is alive, and COVID-19 is making things even worse for people living with HIV. Thank you.
Thank you, three brilliant women. I really appreciate you joining us. Thank you for everyone else joining us this morning, this afternoon. Have good, healthy days and look forward to taking forward this work across many donors into the future. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.